The moment the chairman of the board called my name, my Uncle Harold's face went completely still. Not the practiced stillness of a man who had prepared for this. The frozen kind. The kind that happens when something you were absolutely certain could never occur. Just walked through the door and sat down at the head of the table. I didn't look at him right away. I took my time setting my leather portfolio on the table, smoothing my jacket, pulling out the chair that had my name card on it. A small card, simple black lettering, Serena Caldwell, Chief Fiduciary Officer, Caldwell Family Trust. Then I looked at him. Harold Caldwell, 63 years old, my father's younger brother, the man who had managed the Caldwell family holdings for the past 11 years, stared at me like I had walked in from a different dimension, which, in a way, I had. Let me back up. My father, George Caldwell, built everything from a single dry goods warehouse in Cincinnati in 1987. By the time I was born, his only child from his first marriage. The Caldwell name was on 3 regional distribution centers, a cold storage logistics company, and a small but profitable private equity stake in a grocery chain that would later go public and make the family genuinely wealthy. Not famous wealthy, not flashy, but the kind of quietly substantial that gets you into rooms without having to explain yourself. My mother died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to gone. After that, it was just my father and me in that big house in Indian Hill, and for a while that was enough. Then Harold came back from his second divorce, and everything started to shift. My father loved his brother. That's the simplest way I know to explain what happened over the next few years. He loved Harold the way you love someone you've watched struggle their whole life, with guilt and protectiveness, and a kind of willful blindness that only blood can produce. Harold had never been good with money. He'd never been particularly good with much. But he was charming, and he was family, and my father put him in charge of the trust administration when I was 15, right around the time he started having health problems of his own. I won't say Harold was cruel to me. It wasn't dramatic like that. It was quieter, more consistent. He had a way of being in the room when my father and I talked that made me feel like a guest. A way of redirecting conversations. A way of being the one who handed my father his medication, who coordinated with his doctors, who sat in on financial meetings that I was told were too complex for me at the time. I was 15. Then 17. Then I graduated high school and went to Ohio State on a scholarship I had earned myself. Because by then something in me had decided I didn't want to depend on anyone in that house for anything I could get on my own. My father came to my graduation. Harold drove him. I majored in finance, minored in accounting, got my CPA license before I turned 24, then went back for my JD with a concentration in estate law. 7 years of working 60-hour weeks at a firm in Columbus that specialized in exactly one thing: trust litigation. Families tearing each other apart over money. I had seen every variation of it by the time I turned 31. I understood things about my family's financial structure that Harold had no idea I understood. That was not an accident. My father called me the December before he died. It was a Sunday, and I remember I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger because I had forgotten to buy coffee, and my apartment was freezing, and I didn't want to go back inside without it. He sounded tired in a way that was different from how he usually sounded tired. "I want to talk to you about the trust," he said. "Okay," I said. I kept my voice even. "Harold has been good to me," he said. "You know that." I did not say what I was thinking. I said, "I know you believe that, Dad." There was a pause. "I've been reviewing some things, with a new advisor. Someone Harold doesn't know." Another pause. I should have done it sooner. My father passed away, the following 68, from congestive heart failure that had been managed and then stopped being managed. He left behind a trust worth roughly $14 million, a logistics company that had since been sold, and a letter he had written to me. Through the new advisor, an estate attorney named Margaret Osai, who had been operating completely separately from Harold's oversight for the past 4 months. I read the letter twice in Margaret's office, and then I put it in my bag, and I thanked her, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning the lights on. The letter said, "I'm sorry, it took me so long to see clearly. I am leaving you the authority to fix what I should have fixed myself. I trust you completely. I always should have." Harold did not know about Margaret O.C. He did not know about the parallel review my father had quietly commissioned in those final months. He did not know that my father had executed an amended trust document in January, 6 weeks before he died, that restructured the administrative authority of the Caldwell Family Trust, removing Harold's roles as sole trustee and creating a new position, Chief Fiduciary Officer, with primary authority over all distributions, investments, and strategic decisions. A position that had been created specifically for me. He did not know any of this because he had spent 11 years being very confident that he was the only person paying attention. I had spent 7 years making sure he stayed that way. The Caldwell Family Trust quarterly review was held at the offices of Hargrove and Sills in downtown Cincinnati on the 41st floor, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Ohio River that my father had always loved. The meeting had been scheduled by Harold's assistant. The agenda Harold had circulated listed him as the presiding trustee. He walked in with his attorney, a man named Douglas Price, 51, who had represented Harold's interests for the better part of a decade. Behind them came my father's 2 surviving siblings, my Aunt Francine, 70, and my Uncle Ray, 68. And Harold's son from his first marriage, my cousin Mitchell, 34, who worked vaguely in commercial real estate and had the look of someone who had spent his whole life expecting inheritance. I was already seated when they came in. Harold stopped when he saw me, just for a second. Then he recovered and smiled the way he always smiled, broad, warm, completely practiced. "Serena realized you were coming." "I was invited," I said. He looked at Douglas Price. Price looked back at him. They had a whole conversation in that look that took about 2 seconds, and I watched every word of it. Harold sat down across from me. He set his leather folder on the table with the calm of a man who believed he controlled this room. "Well," he said, "we're glad to have you. It's important for you to be informed about the trust, of course, as a beneficiary." The word beneficiary was very carefully chosen. A beneficiary is a recipient, someone who waits, someone who is given things by people with actual authority. "Of course," I said. Margaret O.C. came in 2 minutes later with the representatives from Hargrove and Sills, and a woman I'll call the compliance auditor, because that's what she was, an independent CPA named Ruth Ann Belcher, who had been retained for the last 4 months to review every transaction the Caldwell Trust had processed since Harold took over administration. Harold didn't know who Ruth Ann Belcher was. He looked at her the way you look at anyone who enters a room you think you own, politely, briefly, dismissively. Then the chairman of the board, the senior partner of Hargrove and Sills, a man named Garfield Watts, 70, who had known my father for 30 years, called the meeting to order and introduced me, and said my title. And Harold's face went completely still. I want to describe what happened next carefully because I think the order of events matters. The first thing Harold did was laugh. It was a short laugh, not quite natural, but he recovered quickly. "Chief Fiduciary Officer," he repeated. When did this happen?" George didn't mention. "The amendment was executed in January," Margaret said. She slid a copy across the table. "You were not notified at that time because the document specifically restricted advance disclosure to preserve the integrity of the parallel review process." Harold looked at the document. Douglas Price looked at the document. Mitchell, my cousin, looked at his father. "This isn't," Harold started. "Valid?" Garfield Watts said mildly. "It is. We've reviewed it thoroughly." Harold put the document down. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw him without the warmth, without the practiced patience, just the thing underneath, which was cold and calculating and not particularly happy with me. "Serena," he said, In a voice he was working very hard to keep reasonable. "I think there may have been some confusion in your father's final months. He was on a significant amount of medication. His judgment was excellent," Margaret said. "The amendment was witnessed by 3 independent parties," Garfield Watts added. "And I spoke with him extensively," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since the introductions. I let the room settle for a moment before I continued. "We had 4 conversations between January 2nd and February 17th. I have recordings of all of them, with his consent. If you'd like to suggest his judgment was impaired, you're welcome to try. But I'd recommend talking to your attorney first." Harold looked at Douglas Price. Douglas Price did not look particularly helpful. Ruth Ann Belcher had been very thorough. 11 years of trust administration, quarterly statements, investment returns, advisory fees, management fees, expense reimbursements, distributions to beneficiaries that were sometimes late, sometimes reduced from what the trust documents allowed, with justifications that were technically defensible if you didn't look too carefully and completely indefensible if you did. The number Ruth Ann had arrived at after 4 months of analysis was $1.3 million. Not stolen outright, nothing so crude. Advisory contracts with firms Harold had undisclosed interests in, management fees paid to an LLC Harold had created and never disclosed as a related party, expense reimbursements for trust administration costs that included a vacation to Costa Rica, the renovation of Harold's kitchen in Indian Hill, and $11,000 in what was categorized as professional development for Mitchell, whose vague real estate career had apparently required a great deal of supporting. Harold had been very careful. He was not careless about money, whatever his ex-wives might have said about him. He had constructed the whole thing like a house of cards that was also, technically, a house. Every card was labeled. Every label had a document behind it. Every document was, in isolation, not obviously wrong. But Ruth Ann Belcher had not looked at them in isolation. She had laid them all out flat on the table, side by side, in chronological order, and then she had drawn lines between them. And what the lines described was a pattern, a deliberate, sustained, 11-year pattern of self-dealing at the expense of my father's estate. She walked the room through it for 47 minutes. I sat quietly and watched Harold's attorney take notes that grew increasingly frantic as she spoke. Aunt Francine, who had always been fond of Harold, in the distracted way people are fond of family members they don't see very often, stopped looking fond about 20 minutes in. Uncle Ray said nothing, but he was watching Harold with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd believed for a long time. Mitchell looked at the table. When Ruth Ann finished, Harold said, "This is a selective reading of documentation that can be explained." "I'm sure it can be," I said. "You'll have an opportunity to explain it." "What does that mean?" "It means we've filed a report with the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division," Margaret said. "As required by statute, when a trustee audit identifies potential self-dealing above certain thresholds, they will conduct their own review." Harold's face did something complicated. Then, "You filed already." 3 days ago, I said. "The meeting today is a courtesy. You were going to find out anyway, and my father would have wanted you to find out with family present." That last part was true. It was the one thing I had thought about the hardest, in the months of preparation. How my father would have wanted this handled. He had loved Harold. He had been wrong about Harold. But he was a man who believed in dignity, and he would not have wanted his brother walked out of a room in handcuffs if it could be handled in a conference room first. So I had given Harold a conference room. What happened after was not in my hands. Harold's attorney asked for a recess. They took 40 minutes. When they came back, Douglas Price asked about the possibility of a negotiated resolution, a repayment structure, a formal release of claims. I had been prepared for this. "The civil claims are mine to negotiate," I said. "The Attorney General's investigation is not." "Serena." Harold's voice was different now. The warmth was gone and something older and desperate had taken its place. "We're family. Your father wouldn't have wanted. My father wrote me a letter, I said. I know exactly what he wanted. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. The drive home took 20 minutes. I stopped at the same Kroger where I'd been sitting in the parking lot when my father called me that Sunday in December, which I realized only when I was already in the parking lot. I sat there for a few minutes with the engine running. I thought about the first time Harold had called me a beneficiary in a room full of people. The way the word had been designed to reduce me, to place me in a category of people who receive, who wait, who are managed. I thought about 7 years of 60-hour weeks, about estate law textbooks and trust litigation files, and the particular education you get watching families discover that love and money are two things that do not automatically protect each other. I thought about my father's voice on the phone. I should have done it sooner. I went inside and bought coffee and drove home. The Ohio Attorney General's office completed its review 8 months later. Harold Caldwell was required to repay $1.3 million to the Caldwell Family Trust, with interest, over a structured 5-year period secured by a lien on his property. He was barred from serving as a trustee or fiduciary in the state of Ohio for 15 years. Douglas Price, whose firm had facilitated 2 of the undisclosed advisory contracts, reached a separate settlement with the state bar and surrendered his license for 3 years. Mitchell lost his consulting arrangement with the trust, which had been paying him a monthly retainer Harold had approved without proper authorization. Aunt Francine called me after the judgment. She said, "Your father would be proud." She said it simply, without drama, and I believed her. Uncle Ray sent a card. Inside it said, "He fooled me too. I'm sorry." I kept that card. The Caldwell Family Trust has a new investment manager now, a firm with no connection to Harold or to anyone Harold knows. The quarterly meetings are different. There is an agenda that I set, and it is followed. And when the meeting ends, the decisions that were made are the decisions that get implemented. My father built something real. He built it with 30 years of early mornings and careful decisions, and a faith in people that was sometimes misplaced. What I did was not undo any of that. What I did was protect it. Some people, when they hear this story, want to know if I feel sorry for Harold. I tell them the truth. I feel sorry for the version of Harold who might have been different, who might have just asked for help when he needed it, instead of taking it in a way that required him to hide what he'd done for 11 years. That version, I think, existed at some point. He was as a man who struggled, who was proud, who made one decision and then had to keep making it in order to protect the first one. That's the thing about self-deception. It compounds. But I don't feel sorry for what happened to him. He made choices. He made them for 11 years, in small, careful increments, betting that no one was paying close enough attention. I was paying attention. I had been paying attention since I was 15 years old, sitting in rooms where I was supposed to feel like a guest in my own house, watching a man who believed the future of my family belonged to him by default. It didn't. It never did. And on a cold Tuesday morning, on the 41st floor of a building, overlooking the Ohio River, in a conference room with a view my father loved, I made sure he finally understood that.